Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is CALLAN STEINMANN. I'm Curator of Education here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's program. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Jeff Richmond-MOLL, American Art Curator here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and he'll begin today's program.
Thanks, Callan. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Angela Miller, who will be speaking to us today. She is Professor of Art History at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Miller is author of Empire of the Eye, Landscape Representation in American Cultural Politics, which received awards from the American Studies Association and Smithsonian American Art Museum. And she was the lead author with Janet Berlo, Bryan and Jennifer Roberts of American Encounters, Cultural Identity, Art History and Cultural Identity. Her recent article, Vibrant Matter, The Countermodern World of Pavel Tchelitchew, was published in the Art Bulletin last year. And her current book project, which she'll be sharing about a bit today, and which was supported by the National Gallery, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, focuses on the queer artists and writers anchored by Lincoln Kirstein in the years around World War II. Dr. Miller will give her presentation, and then we'll kind of reconvene at that point to have a time for Q&A with you all, the audience. And so please feel free to enter your questions along the way, and continue to share them with us at the end of the lecture. So without further ado, Dr. Miller.
Oh, thank you, Jeffrey. And also, thank you for your wonderful exhibition. It's a really timely and foundational new kind of bringing together of this very, very important movement. And I also wanted to thank Callan STEINMANN for all the help along the way. And also a thank you to Philip Elizoff for his foundational work on Paul Cadmus, and also for his ongoing and enthusiastic support for magic realism. I'm so happy to be here and to have a chance to look at the material that I'm working on in my own research from a slightly different angle, through the lens of the exhibition that Jeffrey has put together. As the Georgia Museum of Art's Extraordinary argues, magic realism was not a self-identified movement. It was a regionally and socially diverse phenomenon. It was constituted around artists who were in many cases very private, very idiosyncratic. On one end of the spectrum were figures like Jared French, who, this is a painting in the exhibition, who devised a private mythology centered around symbols that communicated primarily to those within his own circle of intimates. French seems to have cared very little about public exhibition or about sales or about critical recognition. On another point on the spectrum were a group that I call, or have been referred to in the 1930s and 40s as social surrealists. Artists like Louis Guglielmi, who used enigma and illogical juxtapositions to bring to light the absurd injustices driven by a social system whose primary logic was financial gain over human community. Magic realism as a term spans this wide spectrum from arcane to the more socially recognizable landscapes of the present. And we might then well ask what qualities these artists held in common. So today I want to talk about a subset within this movement, a group of queer artists based in the New York City metropolitan area in the years around World War II. And in order to ground this, let's consider some of the features they shared with other artists from around the country who were working in a related manner. Unlike European surrealism, just to put this red herring to rest at the start of the talk. Magic realism was not linked so directly to the operations of the unconscious. American practitioners of surrealism like Federico Castellón, who was a countryman of Salvador Dali, both Spanish American. Castellón was working in the United States, but also Kay Sage derived their imagery from the work not only of Dali, but in the case of Sage, from her husband, Yves Tanguy. And their art is certainly enigmatic, but the enigmas seem to be drawn from out of a more recognizable repertoire of forms. Unlike surrealism, magic realism looked to no particular network of established figures. Those who first wrote about it, like Lincoln Kirstein, linked it to an older native tradition, born in the United States, that is, of tight, meticulous, airless, or non-atmospheric painting, a tradition of, in his words, strong, delicate, and austere elegance. And I'll go back to this painting by Jared French. As the term took shape in Kirstein's and Dorothy Miller's 1943 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, magic realism traced its roots to American Romanticism of the 19th century, in which the artist possessed a visionary power to restore mystery and enchantment to a world increasingly measured and defined by a materialist and extractive mindset as the nation expanded westward. And this is Cole's Titan's Goblet in the Metropolitan Museum, which uses interesting distortions of scale and obviously a fantastical landscape to evoke a kind of mythical world rooted somewhere in the past. Cole's, so this is the exhibition in which Cole's painting was included and on which Kirstein worked with Miller, who was the curator of American painting at the Modern. But much magic realism, unlike earlier forms of Romanticism, was firmly rooted in the social and cultural landscapes of the present. I don't know if you can see those IDs. But this was a present that threatened the sovereign freedom of the artist's imagination, the present as a limiting condition on how artists responded and represented their world. Magic realism was, in this sense, an alternative version of the real at a time when social realism seemed inadequate to capture the full unreality of a world ever more centralized and administered, a world that turned its gaze away from the realities of death, of social and racial marginalization, of the death camps of Europe. Magic realists turned to the imagination as a source of resistance to the everyday, as it was increasingly commandeered by corporate media, by advertising, and by consumer culture. In place of the official story of the nation in the years around World War II, these artists offered private reflections on life in the US as witnessed and experienced by those who did not recognize themselves or their communities in the nation's standardized and manufactured self-image. Those who felt out of sync with the future-oriented pulse of the nation. Instead, they reframed the national landscape through the lens of their own private worlds. Let's look at that national landscape, that official version of the United States. Can be traced to an episode in 1939 with Europe on the brink of war, when corporate business, in tandem with the municipal government of New York City, staged the New York World's Fair at Flushing Meadows, a great spectacle of streamlined futurity, visited by millions of Americans. The nation's entry into global war in 1941 jump-started the US economy and set the stage for the nation's economic, military, and industrial ascendancy. Henry Luce dubbed this the American century in the same year. In the decades between the wars, an expanding middle class took shape around new levels of material comfort. Dreams of unfettered consumption promised relief from boredom and the stalled dreams of the Depression years. And a national media spread through a newly electrified nation spoke in a familiar voice that webbed Americans together. Millions paid their dues and secured their place in this official version of the nation, but a version that is belied by other kinds of evidence. As you see in Margaret Bourke-White's very ironic image of a group of flood victims from the 1937 Louisville flood lining up for relief against the backdrop of the Americans, prophetically American century. This corporate version of the good life promised to bleach away the wistful, the melancholic, the drab, and the setbacks of those suffering the effects of poverty and racialized environmental injustice. The time-worn landscapes of Walker Evans, which you see down below here, another very ironic juxtaposition of Hollywood images against a backdrop of row houses needing paint. So Walker Evans and also Edward Hopper, who Lincoln Kirstein called the dean of American symbolic realism, for his lonely, deserted and shadowed urban streets, his abandoned mansard mansions, his dense and dark woods pressing in on country roads. All these carry mysteries in the face of the meretricious animation of show windows and the glistening welcome of the gasoline station. I'm talking about this pharmacy window and against the backdrop of those deserted streets. What Kirstein in 1950 named as the chronic loneliness of an American tradition that also drew artists toward new symbols, quote, personal allegories and individual lyricism. Priscilla Roberts, and this is another painting in the exhibition, who was among the most admired magic realists of these years. Roberts painted in an Emily Dickinson-like isolation. She explored things lost to memory in the tidal wave of the present, consigned to a perpetual attic. Her obsessive, meticulous paintings explored the musty corners wherein memories lurked to sabotage the bright daylight claims of the streamlined future. Roberts cultivated the odd remnants and haunted regions of American history. And this is one of her several paintings she did of attics, including a spinning wheel and a reproduction of Emanuel Lewitz's Washington crossing the Delaware, and then a few other strange remnants and busts, and this doll that recurs in a number of her works. Her work is steeped in a sense of wistful longing for something that has already happened and left only its faint trace on the present. It cannot be named, but it speaks not only of loss, but of dreams and fantasies burned away by the megawattage of the American century. In pawn shops and antique stores, pulling her little wagon behind her, Roberts found the silence of a forgotten past that lingered into the present. This pervading sense of melancholy also infuses the work of Andrew Wyeth, of Paul Cadmus, George Tooker, and others who saw America from the other end of the telescope, inverted and unrecognizable to those who place their faith in a future of growth and prosperity. What then, Sorry, I've gotten out of order here a bit. What then are the elements of queer or symbolic realism? And I borrow the latter term from Kirstein, having written the essay for the American Realist and Magic Realist exhibition of 1943. Kirstein coined a new term to identify the artists he supported, collected, and wrote about. And this is a view of his home with 3 paintings by Jared French that he collected. He featured their work in an exhibition of that name in 1950, which opened in New York and then in London. So I want to look at the artists he closely patronized and collected, the 3 artists I'm going to talk about today. Like other magic realists in these years, these artists glimpsed the beauty and mystery of the world in brief revelatory moments when the real becomes intensified to hallucination, when one senses a different order of the real running beneath the everyday. Tooker's Sleepers evoke such a moment of epiphany in the reclining figure on the left, who is not asleep, but who gazes languidly toward the heavens, his body relaxed but alert. 2 other sleepers seem lost to the world, their bodies curving into the ridges of sand, which in turn echo the pattern of waves breaking along the coast below them. Ambiguities of scale transform these life-size figures into giants resting atop a cliff that plunges toward the sea. Here, sleep suggests communion with universal rhythms, as well as a retreat from the din of a public world in 1951 that was filled with the angry bluster of Senator Joseph McCarthy and his anti-communist crusade in the Senate. But sleep had a different significance in the 1950s, a state one might describe as sleepwalking or narcosis, a willed oblivion to the forces of repression acting within American culture. For Tooker, that condition signified a fatal lack of awareness, or what today we would call being woke. Tooker pursued the theme of narcosis throughout the 1950s. In Waiting Room, which he painted at the end of the decade, you have a collection of anonymous figures whose vision is hooded by the media saturated society of the mid-century. And you can see this woman whose face is blocked out by the mass circulation journal that she reads. And we can't really see any of their faces. They're all either hooded or closed lidded or hiding behind spectacles and masks. All are blocked. They're either hooded by this media environment or else by spiritual exhaustion, but they're blocked in one way or another from the nourishing energies of human communion and meaningful exchange. Here and elsewhere in Tooker's work, the spatial symbol of such a condition is the grid, compartmentalizing and containing the expansive and fully sentient body attuned to the natural world, which he explored elsewhere. Don Siegel's 1956 film, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, also builds his narrative around sleepwalking. The everyday normality of his American small town is suddenly invaded by an alien force, a multi-pronged metaphor for a society lulled asleep by complacency and by a conservative belief in the status quo. I want to go back to this painting. Those whose personal experiences, as in the emigre artist Henry Kerner, who's also included in the exhibition, whose personal experiences gave them horrifying insights into the realities of systematic murder, of lynching. Just point out this figure in the background who is hanging from the destroyed cupola of this church. And cultural destruction, but whose rantings provoke only mirth and dismissal among his neighbors. It's a very terrifying painting. But still there was a world of perfect quietude and internal order that lay beyond the ordinary and everyday. It had to be seized by the individual imagination of the artist from out of the disorder of the world. What the critic Eleanor Munro called in 1955 the, quote, dervish world of perpetual motion and direction, a world in which human and social relations dissolved into flux under the pressure of continual innovation. Queer magic realists refused to acquiesce in this narcosis of the normal. But therein lies its difference from modernist artists at the same time and earlier, who also resisted this normalization of vision, but who did so by rupturing language and form itself. Whereas magic realists enacted their break through traditional means. These artists anchored their sense of the modern moment in the deeper histories of art and culture, reaching back to the Renaissance and to the anatomical study of the human form. This is French with his anatomical atlas, drawings behind him, looking rather lugubrious. In these deeper histories, reaching back to the Renaissance, their sense of the present, in other words, had deep roots in the soil of history and of myth. They were all devoted to a figural language that looked back to the early Renaissance of Piero, of Mantegna, of Luca Signorelli, and others. And this photograph of the three artists, here is Cadmus in the foreground, and I'll go back to this image, Tooker in the middle, and then in the distance is Jared French. And this was done at Cadmus's St. Luke's Place studio in Lower Manhattan. And on the side, you see a gallery of images. I will show you what those are momentarily, but really sort of kind of announcing the extent to which these artists are working in communion with history as they are in communion with one another. Jared French turned back in particular to the first archaic expression of the body in the kouros figure of Greek 6th century sculpture, as you see here. The kouros appears and reappears throughout his work in the 40s and 50s. This is a work from 1943 called Murder, which clearly references National Socialist ritual and spectacle in relation to the biblical theme of Adam, Cain, and Abel, and fratricidal murder. Cadmus's, their turn to Renaissance precedent, however, was not academic, as some people continue to claim. It is an old language appropriated for new ends, a figural language they endowed with uncanny force. Extracted from its religious context in Catholicism, they reclaimed Renaissance figuration and academic figuration more broadly as a means to still the dervish energies of modern life. They turned academic tools against themselves, transforming the optical brilliance of a day on the beach into an uncanny vision that guides the imagination away from the received or habitual pathways of association and perception to recover a sense of strange stillness and prophetic vision. In the staged photographs of Pajama, made collaboratively by Paul Cadmus, Jared and Margaret French, Jared French married to Margaret, and The term pajama, the name pajama comes from the first syllable of each of their three names, Paul, Jared, and Margaret. This quality of stillness or immobility reverberates with a sense of suspended animation. Time seems to turn back on itself, returning modern men and women to the recurring cycles of myth. The most animated elements in these photographs are the wind-twisted driftwood, movable props they used in a variety of situations. And that does recur in a number of their photographs. A second aspect of their return to tradition was their preferred choice of medium, which was tempera. The queer magic realists joined a tempera revival that hit full stride with the publication of Daniel Thompson's The Practice of Tempera Painting in 1936. This would become the Bible of the queer symbolic realists, and it draws on this older tradition going back to Cennino Cennini's Craftsman's Handbook from the Renaissance. Tempera's translucency and high value, as well as its lack of impasto or paint body, gave to it a certain chasteness. This is Tooker's really wonderful self-portrait from 1947, which clearly references Bronzino. It's got these marvelous elements of trompe-l'oeil in the background, and then this kind of emblem of a kind of insular selfhood that he holds in his hand, this nautilus. These qualities of tempera were very much contrasted to the quality of oil, the oil medium, which they stopped working in the early 1930s, which has a kind of viscosity, a voluptuous pliancy that made it the perfect medium for painting bodies. And as Willem de Kooning observed, painting the flesh of women in particular, giving it a certain heterosexist investment. Oil could be dabbed, slathered, blended, and swirled. It favored process over intentionality and deliberation. The queer magic realists carefully planned and plotted their work in advance, leaving nothing to chance. This is a detail of the image that I showed just a minute ago of Paul painting, a painting that we're going to look at shortly, which is What I Believe. Tempera required careful manual preparation in the studio. Rather than squeezing paint out of a tube, the pigment was mixed with egg yolk to create a glossy but quick drying and unforgiving medium, requiring tiny brushes and meticulous application. Tempera also involved small repeating hand movements to build up layers and shading. Cadmus compared these repetitive and regular brushstrokes and movements of the hand to heartbeats, which transformed painting into a kind of ritual of meditative enactment. And tempera had one other quality that they valued. Unlike oil, it resisted the material traces of time. It didn't crack or darken or stretch or flake, but retained its jewel-like vibrancy. It was very stable, almost impervious to physical wear. The result was a form of non-atmospheric hypervisualization, which was Kirstein's word, hypervisualization, that seemed to arrest the movements of time. Cadmus, French, and Tooker shared in magic realism's oblique perspective on the social world of the nation, but they also queered mainstream American versions of sexuality at a time when all forms of non-normative sexuality were targeted, harassed, and surveilled. They lived openly queer lives. They formed binding friendships, and they painted for one another more than for the market. Collectively, they created a vibrant and self-sustaining community centered around their mutual interests and passions. And here you see the sources that are shown on the right side of the photograph of George Platt Lynes, their friends, which go from a fresco in Pompeii to the work of Piero, Giovanni Bellini, and also the work of Raimondi after Raphael, and much more, which I can't identify. I think there's a Goya there as well. So this is, as I say, a kind of communion with the history of art, as we see from this photograph. One of Jared French's first magic realist works refers quite directly to Piero della Francesca, the 15th century Renaissance artist whose poised and massive figural compositions inspired a broad revival of interest in the decades between the wars. But French transformed Renaissance religious art into a different register of meaning. Washing the white blood from Boone is a counter version of the American myth of wilderness conquest, a conquest which displaced indigenous cultures during the colonization of the continent. Oh, here is the source in Piero, the baptism of Christ, quite direct appropriation, but obviously a major reworking of that older theme. But reaching back into the 19th century, Boone was the very symbol of the nation's westward moving empire. This is a painting in our collection here at Washington University, which has been traveling widely. It's a kind of iconic image of wilderness conquest, now rendered very problematic in the present moment, but continues to be a kind of text of the ideologies of Western expansion and settler, what is now called settler colonialism. French rechristens Boone within a circle of quasi-identical, darker-skinned figures. They become allegories of a different humanity, one that is closer to the origins of life. There's no effort here to make them look like Native Americans. They're symbols, they're symbolic in character. And this new redemption occurs not through Christian sacrifice, but through the sacrament of the body, placed back into the world of nature and of cultures living within nature. French drew his inspiration for this work from the English novelist D.H. Lawrence, one of the great myth makers of 20th century modernist literature. And Lawrence prophesied the revival of Western civilization through what he called blood consciousness. That is, a recognition that body and spirit, mind and nature were all webbed together. For Lawrence, modernizing cultures had worn away the sensitive skin of the human, blunting the senses and draining the primal energies that connected the human to a larger universe. Sex was one such primal force of renewal and revitalization. And for this queer circle, desire drove creativity. For French and others steeped in the mythic world of the Italian Renaissance, the male principle was priapic, referring back to the Greek god of Priapus, linked to the power of the male seed, which rivaled the reproductive powers of women. Cadmus is what I believe is the most programmatic expression of their alternative queer world. And this is the painting that was on the, that is on the table that Cadmus is working on. Cadmus framed this world in opposition to the racially and ethnically mixed crowd on the right as they revel their way all unknowingly toward the grave. This is a very detailed painting. It's very small and it deserves a great deal more discussion. But if you can see this motley crew in the background, motley bodies, motley racial and ethnic figures, And then in the foreground, this rather beautiful but saturnine group of this dark-skinned kind of satyr-like figure with his wife and child, and then in the foreground, a figure of kind of allegory of death, clutching his face in horror. Now, I confess to not liking this painting. I think it's filled with elitist condescension toward those who are less socially, physically, and intellectually endowed. Kirstein remarked about Cadmus that he was a physical snob, and that's certainly evident in this painting. But it seems to pose, the painting itself seems to pose a pointed question about the future of a less enlightened humanity, as shown on the right. And in the background of the painting is this big question mark that is formed by the clouds in the background. And then this other detail that I want to point out, which is the lighthouse shining its beam out and pointing it in the direction of this enlightened society of the elect. And as I say, there's a lot more to be said about this, but let me point out here that the erotic energies of these chiseled bodies on the left side of the painting are not directed as they are on the right toward reproduction. In this avowedly queer world, beautiful bodies work in tandem with cultured minds to create a society elevated by knowledge. The lighthouse in the distance beams its light into the foreground society of the elect. But let us not forget that these queer magic realists shared their devotion to art making and to one another during a time that witnessed an intensifying surveillance of non-normative sexuality. French and others in his circle lived with the constant knowledge of how their own bodies and desires were criminalized by law. It's a wonderful painting in the Cleveland Museum of Art. With a powerful economy of means, French staged the social shaming of the body suffered by men who loved men, along with the erasure of their identities. Queer men could also feel hounded into marriage against their wishes. George Tooker imagines here his fate as a chess game, this kind of indicated by this kind of checkered floor that he paints. And the rules here are clearly already rigged against him. There's a commanding and punishing maternal figure who looms over the scene, kind of figure of the social super ego, foisting this curiously desexed future bride onto the frightened young man whose way forward is blocked at every point of access. Can't go backward, he can't go forward. There's a crew of people gazing into the scene from the distance, from the background. Heteronormativity was centered in these decades around the socially reproductive functions of the nuclear family at mid-century and around the containment and channeling of male sexuality. But this is a strange painting by Jared French State Park from, I think it's 1946. And here he's using the Kuros figure, this strange kind of defamiliar, kind of uncanny, it's identifiably male, but it's also sculptural, it's also rigid, it's also has this kind of disciplinary force and frightening, threatening quality to it, standing guard over this family of three who are shaded by their great umbrella in a kind of metaphoric sense of containment. Among the queer magic realists, sexuality was deterritorialized, so to speak. That is, that it was no longer linked to stable monogamous relationships centered around the family. That said, there were many lifetime, if non-monogamous, partnerships among the group. In place of the ostensibly more stable pairing of two in the nuclear family and marriage, those within the circle often found themselves in groupings of three. Three was a queer number, connoting instability, negotiation, surprise, magic, and mystery. Three was a dangerous number, but those in the circle welcomed danger because it gave an edge to their lives, an element of drama that informs some of the best work of this circle. This is the shower, which is done on Fire Island, where they spent their summers. And this is not realism. This is a kind of allegorical projection of the complicated circuit of desire among the three who formed a household and a ménage à trois. Jared and Cadmus having been lovers prior to Jared French's marriage to Margaret, and who continued that relationship after the marriage. So a very complicated ménage à trois. The other side of the poised immobility of the figures in many of these works is then a sense of drama. In Cadmus's Shells and Figure of 1940, the dramatic element was transferred to nature. The graceful sweeping curves of the two overscaled shells seem to enact an animate drama of desire, their sensuously intertwining shapes suggesting polymorphous energies, spiraling, twisting, bending, and arcing toward one another, as if nature itself were participating in the spectacle of erotic longing and desirous coupling. Their forms loom above the horizon with virile force, their scale magically expanded in relation to the tiny figure framed by their hollowed out shapes. He seems languid, pinioned within these shapes. The animation of the human seems to have migrated to the forms of nature, leaving figures isolated and immobilized in a landscape that surges with energies. Conventional measures of scale do not matter. Nature's forms carry their own internal logic. Now, Jeffrey Richmond-MOLL has suggested that in magic realism, nature is no longer a mute and passive sphere acted on by humans, but instead is internally animated, as I've been suggesting about this painting. And other scholars suggest an emerging form of biocentrism, a shift from human to natural actors, and to the artist as one who works within rather than through nature's energies. Cadmus's 1946 painting, The Inventor, distills into its tiny frame many elements of queer symbolic realism. It is, first of all, a work about art making. The artist at its center is modeled on Cadmus's lover at the time, the young and retiring George Tooker. He holds aloft a mobile made of driftwood, scalloped shells, feathers, weathered wood, and a kind of marine carapace, this kind of skeletal form here. His bony, foreshortened right hand recalls the Renaissance artists so admired by Cadmus, both Signorelli, but also Mantegna in particular. Its small scale summons tremendous visual force, standing in front of a door that opens toward a landscape of beach, sea, and sky. The young artist inventor seems poised at the brink of creation, conjuring inanimate objects into life. Eyes peer out of weathered wood. I don't know if you can see this here. I don't have this detail over here. Branches metamorphose into squawking birds or snakes. The artist at the center of the image is a magus, and the mobile, a miniature world activated into sentience by him, by the artist magus. Magus is a kind of magician working within the world. and one who is a knowing partner to nature's secrets. Now, an odd feature of the painting is the gnarled creature attached to the mobile by one branch-like arm. Talking about this portion of the painting. Its extremities, extremities formed by rooty tendrils, its head hanging down, and its cavernous mouth open in a shriek. Situated somewhere between the plant and animal world, this odd creature invokes the medieval image of a shrieking mandrake pulled from the soil. The mandrake was associated with folklore, magic, and medicinal uses as both a narcotic and an aphrodisiac. The mandrake evokes a form of sympathetic magic. Its resemblance to other things in nature, in this case, the sex organs of generation or the testicles, as well as the human torso and limbs, these resemblances endowing it with power over those organs. Sympathetic magic linked the human and natural worlds in chains of analogy. I'd like to end my talk, because I'm going over, I realize, with this marvelous work of 1948 by Cadmus in the collection of the Georgia Museum of Art, a work that expresses with such poignancy a sense of how a materialistic society, channeling its energies into war-making and nation branding, had defaulted on the human potential of its citizens, most of all its youth. Playground is a cross-section of young New Yorkers marginalized by race, ethnicity, poverty, and their yearning same-sex desires. Confined within the constricted and dehumanizing urban spaces that pin them in, they are surrounded by burned out tenements. The background church over here is draped with undergarments, further evidence of the thwarted possibilities for the growth of the spirit. On the ground, banners blaring the violence of war echo the social violence that surrounds them. And William Island's essay details, names what these headlines are. What often goes unnoted in this, in fact, I don't know if it's noted by anyone in precisely the way I'm going to understand it, is the angelic flight of the dark-skinned young man who prepares to launch himself into space, his right hand clinging to the fence as he leans forward toward the heavens. So he's not climbing the fence, he's launching himself from it. You can see up here this detail. The touch of magic realism, this touch of magic realism, nudges Cadmus's vision beyond social observation and into another register. As director William Island notes in his essay on Playground, the painting, quote, presents sexuality as a metaphor of innocence rather than one of menace. Indeed, as in a nation and at a time when any form of sexuality outside the nuclear family was considered dangerous, Playground redeems desire as a life force, yet a life force brutally curtailed and hedged by a social world insensible to its unfolding power. The German Neue Sachlichkeit painter Georg Scholz in the 1920s wrote that, quote, true fantasy is the purified image of the present. We might well reflect on magic realism's greatest contribution to American art, in my mind, through the lens of Scholz's insight, the power of the imagination to decenter, to throw off track the insistent normalization of those forces that ride roughshod over what is best in our collective humanity, but also its power in recovering an expanded universe of sentient energies within which the human is situated. Magic realism, and queer magic realism in particular, dethrones the human, but in doing so, reactivates its vital reciprocity with the world of nature, a world we lose touch with at our peril. Thank you.
Angela, thank you so much for that talk. It was just wonderful, bringing so many new insights to works of art that I've become familiar with, but now feel like I'm seeing anew again. So I want to just, I see a lot of great questions, so I don't want to take too much time by asking my own. So I want to turn to those. The first question that I saw came in, which came in through the chat, and we're going to try to migrate some of those over to the Q&A box so that all audience members can see them written out. But the first one is moving sort of back earlier in the presentation and your reference to the political context of these artists in this moment in American culture. As well as kind of the legacy of magic realism, which is from Morris Grossman, who asked, do you feel the speedy demise of the realists, these realists, in the Cultural War that followed was in part due to the partisan endorsement of the CIA, which led to their work being valued at a fraction of their abstract expressionist contemporaries? What was the role of the sort of Cold War politics, I guess, of the fine arts in the US, and how did that play a role in the legacy of magic realism?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Well, we do know about the CIA, well, not the CIA so much as the
State Department.
State Department, thank you. Sponsorship of abstract expressionism abroad as that kind of expression of freedom in the face of, the politics of the Cold War anti-communist movement. So I mean, certainly, abstract expressionism enjoyed that what I was calling earlier, that kind of megaphone of international circulation and official sponsorship by the US government. So the question is the role that has had in marginalizing magic realism, I think, as I understand it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't honestly think that magic realism was on their radar enough to have been. I mean, I think there were other forces that were pushing abstract expressionism into a position of aesthetic ascendancy in those decades, in those years and that really didn't happen until the late 50s. I mean, I think we give way too much credit to ABEX as the only show in town in the early 50s, and that was not the case. I think that magic realism did have a place and a prominence that we've lost sight of in the late 40s and early 50s, and I think that's a corrective that we need to make, which is that it's, it's only now coming back into focus through the work of scholars like you and me and others around the country, and I would say in the last 25 years or so, and increasingly now in very recent years. But it did have a presence in the exhibitions at the Modern. I mean, Cadmus and the Whitney as well. They were all included in exhibitions that were being sponsored by these institutions. So I wouldn't assume that magic realism. I said it wasn't on their radar, and I'm correcting myself because I think it was on their radar, and it was part of the sort of whole eclectic, wonderfully rich, eclectic, mixed landscape of American art after the war years, in the immediate aftermath of the war, and ABEX only really came into prominence much later and sort of took all the air out of the room. So I hope that's.
Yeah, and I think if I could add on to that, a story that maybe is less familiar, but was told in a past exhibition at the Georgia Museum of Art, is the role of the Advancing American Art Project, which is this book called Art Interrupted, that was published by my predecessor, Paul Manigera. It was only because of this failed attempt at an exhibition sponsored by the State Department that the Georgia Museum of Art even owns Guglielmi's Tenements. Tenements, along with Ben Shah's Clinic, which is another painting in our collection, these pages aren't showing up well on Zoom, but they are both in our permanent collection because it was a disbanded exhibition that never even happened, and the contents of the show were sold off to the likes of the Georgia Museum of Art, the June Collins Smith Museum at Auburn. So, the government tried to get into, I guess, more social surrealism, as you described it, and then ended up censoring itself to the point where the exhibition never occurred. So there's another kind of wrinkle in the story of the government relationship with these artists.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question from Jen Paget, who is interested in the relationship of queer artists to Catholicism. So just to read, I think you suggested it was something they left to the side in their interest in Renaissance work, but I'm wondering if there's more an Oscar Wilde-like fascination with the sensuality, ritual, and bodily engagement of Catholicism and its imagery, as well as Tooker's own later conversion to the faith. Is there more there?
Wow, thank you, Jen. That's a great that's a great insight, and I'm gonna take that up. Yeah, the Oscar Wilde-like sensuality of Catholicism as a kind of elaborated ritual. I would be curious to know where you see that. I think it might be there. There is a ritualistic aspect to Daniel to the Boone, washing the blood of Boone painting that I talked about. But certainly Tooker converts to Catholicism and is a deeply pious, does the series of paintings that represent a kind of humanist Catholicism, a kind of Dorothy Day liberal version of Catholicism as embracing the varieties of humanity and a very appealing form of Catholicism indeed. But he doesn't do that until later. I think, so I'm not sure I see that operating in the 40s and 50s. I have to think about that, and I'd love to talk with you more about it. But thank you for that. I would just say about Oscar Wilde that they constructed as an emerging queer community in the 1940s. They constructed their own genealogy, and it was a genealogy that, and this is something I'm struggling with myself in my own research, that looked back as much to Walt Whitman and to Edmund Carpenter as it did to Wilde. I think they were somewhat uneasy about the kind of flamboyance and the kind of overt performativity of someone like Wilde. I think that they look to a different, as I say, a different genealogy of the homosexual in the early 20th century, which tied it more to a kind of universal brotherhood. But again, there's room for many different influences there. Thank you.
So another, this is sort of a nice insight or comment from Janice Simon, who wonders whether the formidable maternal authority figure in Tooker's chess game painting may be an allusion to the Queen in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. She resembles the illustration depictions in her facial features, and the red hat is rather crown-like. This would add to the frightening authoritarianism of social structure and psychological tension of the overall scene.
Thank you, Janice. That's great. Absolutely. You nailed it. I think that I have to look back at that. That would be as illustrated by Lewis Carroll himself, I assume. But yeah, she's multi-symbol, all of these figural types, I think, are multi-pronged. They're allegorical, but they really refer to, they have a multi-referential kind of quality. So it's certainly, she's a terrifying figure and a threatening figure. And there's a lot more to be said about the problematic status of the American mother in these years relative to the figure of the homosexual, which is something that I'm sort of looking into. But there was a book by Philip, Generation of Vipers. I can't remember the Philip, I blanked out on his name. But yeah, very punishing image of the role of the mother in creating the homosexual and in sort of emasculating the American man. So there's a little bit of that in there, but it's very complicated. It's very complicated. But thank you for that suggestion.
So there are two questions which sort of connect to one another in relation to the conversation around queer identity and these artists. One of them is I'll just sort of read them together. I think we can address them together. The question of the value of extracting queer artists from other artists, male and female, in their extended circle who exchange ideas, exhibited together, and maintain friendships. Were there other artists outside New York who identified with them or interacted with them in terms of this sort of circle that you've identified? And then relatedly, thinking about the city and those networks, Jonathan Waltz asks about how, my French is terrible, so how Didier Eribon's 1999 publication, Reflections on the Gay Question, I assume is a English translation, whether that might help in sort of understanding the idealized landscapes of these paintings, their use of processes and media from the past, but also the role of the rural versus the urban, and how urban areas like New York City were seen as sort of a symbolic safe space for these artists who were moving from more rural locales into the city to escape, as quoting the publication, to escape injury and violence. So, thinking about the value of queer identity to these circles and why we single that out, and also what kind of the role of the rural and the urban in relation to these circles, how that comes into play.
The value of, I'm not sure I quite understand you did a very good job of paraphrasing it, but the importance of queer identity to their aesthetic, to their...
Well, I think it's asking about the larger circle. The Kirstein circle included artists who were not queer, or maybe that could be brought up as a question in of itself, but why extract these particular artists from the Kirstein circle as opposed to others, male and female? And how far did the circle extend? Did it go beyond New York City?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, that's a great, important question. And that really, the framework of my own ongoing research is transatlantic, that it was very much a transatlantic network. And most of the major figures were queer. I can't think of many who weren't. And I don't mean to suggest that they were exclusionary as much as that they could be, and they were often accepted into straight society. I mean, Kirstein, I think, circulated very publicly as a bisexual mover and shaker in the New York cultural scene, married to Fidelma, who was Paul Cadmus' sister, but also incorporating his lovers into their household. So I think they were not openly queer, because they did have to be cautious, but within their own broader cultural network, they could be fairly open in their arrangements. But the transatlantic network was enormously important to them, and it was a literary as much as an artistic network. It involved people like, and Kirstein was kind of at the node, really. He was the pivot. He was, it included W.H. Auden, Christopher Isherwood, and E.M. Forster most prominently, and then a kind of extended literary network that they themselves formed through their reading, which has been very important for my own understanding of them, including people like, mostly, I have to say, artists who were homosexual, writers who were homosexual or bisexual, Thomas Mann, Henry James, Walt Whitman, and many, many others. So it wasn't, and of course, the transatlantic literary modernism of people like T.S. Eliot, who was a very important figure for Kirstein in his early formation, as well as William Butler Yeats, about whom Glenway Westcott wrote, one of the figures in the circle. So it's very complicated, and it is absolutely transatlantic, and it goes way beyond these three figures. I only focused on them because of their involvement with painting and because of their close relationship to Lincoln Kirstein. But I don't know this work by Didier, but please, I'd love to know more about it. If you could put it in the chat for me, I would definitely follow up on it. Thank you. Oh, at the urban rural, I'm not sure what to do with that. These were, the figures in this circle were all very metropolitan. They were not, Cadmus grew up in New York City. Tooker was educated at Harvard. French was educated at Amherst. And they were all very sophisticated, literate, highly educated, urban metropolitan types. So they did spend a lot of time in the country. They spent a lot of time on Fire Island in the summers, which was a kind of proto-gay center for gay men, beginning as early as the 1940s, and also at Glenway Westcott's family's home in New Jersey. So they spent a lot of time in the countryside, but I don't think of them as spanning that urban-rural spectrum so much.
And one thing, I think, just to close, because I'm mindful that we're past the hour, and Angela, I can send you some of these questions and comments from the chat so that you can engage further. But I think your point that this is a transatlantic phenomenon, I think that rings true with a lot of what I wanted to say with this exhibition, which is these broader networks that these artists are engaging in that are transatlantic as well as even hemispheric. You've got Lincoln Kirstein's patronage of Alex Colville in Canada, and you have Alfonso Osorio being the one to bring the news about tempera from Yale to Cadmus and French and Tooker, and Osorio being a Filipino-American artist. So the ties spread far and wide, I think, which was what makes this so rich.
And also Kirstein's patronage or his involvement with Latin American magic realism
Right.
under Nelson Rockefeller during the 1940s.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I will, there are a few more questions and comments that I will send to you so that you have them and can follow up with folks directly. But I just want to thank you again for sharing with us all this, these wonderful insights today. And thank you to the audience for being with us for the afternoon. Look forward to continuing these conversations. And thanks again all for your interest in the exhibition here, which is up through June 13th. So thank you again, Angela.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks to all. And I appreciate the questions. Please send them to me. Thanks again.
Great. Okay, take care.
See ya.